Welcome to the bonus show. Much to the dismay of many people, Elon Musk has been named Time's Person of the Year. The article written about him is quite interesting. It's not all positive. It points out that he's been plagued by sexual harassment allegations and that, commentary about his personal life being sort of a mess in different ways, but he is indeed Time's Person of the Year. People who are upset about this are upset about it on a number of different fronts. Number one, the idea that the richest guy in the world also is the person of the year. It's like, of all the people on earth, the one richest person is also your person of the year. And it sort of seems to be really just saying wealth is the determining factor, because what are the odds that the richest guy is also the person of the year? So that's one aspect people aren't pleased with. Another aspect has been his increased criticism of not the left, but of government infrastructure, often more associated with the left than the right, whether it's regulation, whether it's commentaries on cryptocurrency, whether it's been his sort of resistance to fall in line with OSHA and different work-related elements at factories for Tesla, et cetera, et cetera. I have thought of the Time Person of the Year as increasingly meaningless, quite frankly, Pat. So, like, I have a hard time getting too worked up about it because I already kind of didn't care. But at the same time, it is interesting to see the write-up that they did and sort of the way that they see Elon Musk. I don't know. It's like, should the richest person be the person of the year? Probably not. But it seems mostly that it's a reaction to the existing cultural discussion that already took place.
Well, certainly this day and age, the Time Person of the Year doesn't matter as much, right? Because we live in a world of social media and so many different media outlets. You can look up information about whomever you want to, and it's not like it's one of those things where the Person of the Year gets a ton of attention and you only have a selected number of media outlets. And so this is your opportunity to learn about this particular person. So there's that aspect to it. And also, we have to remember that just because you're Person of the Year, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a positive thing. Like, you could be the Person of the Year for negative reasons as
Sure.
well. Remember, Hitler and Stalin won Person of the Year many decades ago. So I don't think that this is signing off on him being good for society necessarily. So that's important to point out. It's just who's been most influential. And when you look over the past year, I would argue that he probably does deserve this award because he has been so incredibly influential. His net worth has jumped up, and he now is easily the richest person on the planet with reported wealth. Anyway, he has $300 billion almost, which is just absolutely insane to think about. Obviously, the Tesla share price has skyrocketed this year, so that's another reason to give it to him. They've had successful launches with SpaceX, and also he's able to manipulate markets in a way that we've really never seen before. Like, maybe him and Trump have had this ability unmatched by anyone else because, with what he did with cryptocurrency like Dogecoin and how he was able to send up and down the price of Bitcoin, what we saw over the year, that's just like never really been seen before, at least not in a long time, not in my recollection. So, with all of these different aspects, all the different followers that he definitely has a cult of personality behind him. I think it makes sense that he won the award.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you're not wrong in anything you're saying, but the things you're listing make exactly the point that I think some are making, which is he's notorious and powerful in ways which are only, according to some people, valuable to society. Like, what I mean by that is the incredibly increased share price of Tesla stock, which I own, right? Like, I'm not complaining, but only some people believe that that's something important to pay attention to. And you could make the case that, like, we're not even paying attention to the right types of people when we look at Person of the Year. It's just an argument to be had. I'm sort of just playing devil's advocate. And the really crazy thing for me is, because I don't really think this means that much, it's hard for me to be too upset about it.
Yeah, I mean, sort of wrapped up in that is the idea that this has to have a positive connotation, which historically it hasn't. I suppose we can change it so that, you have to actually be doing good for society in order
Yeah.
to win the award. But then obviously, whomever you pick is going to, be reviewed favorably or unfavorably by different groups of people. Like, last year, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won it.
Yeah.
And obviously, some people liked that decision. Other people hated that decision. When Donald Trump won it, there was the exact same thing. And so, I think if we just leave it up to who's been most influential, then that's probably fine going forward. And it's okay to give him the award based on that. And just thinking over the past year, like who would even rival him, I can't think of any specific person. Like sometimes they give it to groups of people. Like, they gave it to whistleblowers one year. They gave it to women who spoke out during the Me Too era in like 2017. They gave it to the computer one year, which was
Yeah.
sort of interesting. So they can give it to groups sometimes. I suppose if you were to give it to a group this year, it would be to the people who developed the vaccine, right? Obviously, because that's helped us get up back on track to some degree with defeating the pandemic. But yeah, when it comes to one specific person, I can't think of anyone else who's been more influential than Elon Musk over the
Yeah, that's
past
fair.
year.
It's like, if not him, who has been more influential over the last year? So, anyway, let us know your thoughts. Elon Musk, Times Person of the Year. You probably remember that Derek Chauvin, former police officer responsible for the death of George Floyd, was found guilty criminally and sentenced to 22 and a half years in the criminal case. He is now also facing a civil rights case. And the original plea was not guilty, but there is now the belief that tomorrow he is going to be changing a plea to guilty, changing a plea to guilty. He's been convicted of murder and manslaughter for the incident where he pinned his knee against George Floyd's neck and ultimately caused the death of George Floyd. The civil rights case now is one that would, if he pleads guilty, it would remove him from a federal trial involving other officers as well. It could increase the total amount of time he'll spend behind bars. It's not totally clear why this is happening, but one of the explanations may be that the other officers have pleaded not guilty, and they were all going to be in this trial as defendants together. By pleading guilty himself, he removes himself from that group trial, and it's believed that that would be better for the other defendants, in that having the already criminally convicted Derek Chauvin there, even though it's a new case and it's not supposed to be considered the fact that he was already found guilty, it could be bad. It could be prejudicial against the other defendants. So there's the belief that him pleading guilty, removing himself from the federal trial, could be good for the other defendants. We don't yet really know that much about this because calls to his attorneys were not returned from a number of different media outlets, including the Associated Press. There's the idea that by taking responsibility, he could reduce his federal sentence, but in total, it's likely to go up. The other possible advantage is he might be able to argue that he serves his entire sentence in the federal prison system, which is generally speaking less harsh than state prison. And that's something that's a consideration as well. So a lot of unknowns here, but it's expected he's going to change his plea to guilty.
Right, a number of different factors. I wonder if one stands out for him more than the others. Like, I wonder if he really does have this or feel this responsibility to his co-defendants and doesn't
Yeah.
want to lower their chances of, getting away with what they did, or at least getting a reduced sentence. So we'll see if that's maybe what was, his reasoning with this. But I'm thinking more that he may just have a sense of being screwed in all of this as it is. Like, he was already found guilty on the state charges, and maybe he just suspects that he wouldn't be able to get acquitted on these federal charges. And so he assesses that the best course of action for him to get the minimal amount of prison time is to just plead guilty, take responsibility. And even though, yes, this is going to lead to ultimately more prison time for him overall, he would otherwise be potentially facing even more. So this is probably his best out. I think that's probably what's going on here.
The other consideration also is, in the federal system, there's no parole. So in practice, with a state sentence, you could expect to at least have a shot at getting out early. You wouldn't in the federal system, but the conditions are generally considered to be better. It's a mess, and I don't. I want to be clear. I don't see him as a victim. He did really bad things and has been convicted, so he deserves it. I don't envy being in a position to have to make these calls in advance of saying, do I chance this or do I chance that? Obviously, he should have not gotten himself into this position in the first place. I want to be clear about that.
Right, and for the people who were upset over him only getting 22 years in prison based on the state charges, for one, that pretty much was in keeping with normal recommendations. So I remember going into sentencing, and I think you sort of expressed the same thing at the time that this would be about what he would get, the 22
Yeah.
years, which because of good behavior and all this stuff means he could get out after 15 years and serve the remainder of his sentence on parole. But based on what the federal sentencing guidelines are, if he is indeed going to plead guilty to this, he could get a range of 27 to 33 years. So ultimately, if you were upset over the fact that he could be let out of prison after 15 years, just know that it may actually be more like 3 decades, which to some people sounds a lot more just.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I'm not, I'm not commenting on his guilt, which is pretty clear. But the idea of having someone say, "You'll now be removed from society for 30 years." I mean, I don't think I'd be able to handle. I don't know what I would experience if I was told that, but I don't even. It's inconceivable to me.
Right, and he's about 45 years old now, I think. So 30
Yeah.
years, that would mean that he'd be an old man when he gets out of prison. And, certainly some people are going to argue that's what should happen. Some people would argue that he should be put away behind bars for the remainder of his life. Other people suspect that, because this wasn't premeditated, and that he didn't explicitly mean to kill George Floyd with what he did, then maybe he should have a lesser sentence. Maybe something like 10 years would be more acceptable. There's a wide range of opinions in all this, but I don't think very many of us are saying that he should just be acquitted entirely. I
No.
suppose some people on the right were arguing that, but certainly not the people in our audience.
Not many. No, not very different circumstances. Certainly to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial for sure. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because it's actually going to be something that, as the 2022 midterms get going, we are going to talk about more. But when the recall effort really got going regarding Gavin Newsom in California, the attempt to recall him and remove him from office, we talked about how low barriers to launch a recall election is yet another tool that the right could weaponize in order to get their people in office without really winning the hearts and minds of the electorate at large. And we are now starting to see more instances of the American right wing weaponizing recalls. Back in 2017, Nevada Republicans tried recall campaigns against 3 state senators. This year in Colorado, 10 Democratic state legislators are now facing recall efforts. And we're starting to see this as a technique be used more and more to try to remove Democratic lawmakers across the country. We're seeing it in Seattle. We are seeing it, I could give you a long list, and it's also being done at the school board level. And so this is like a tactic, it's hyper local as a way to take over not just state legislatures, but even who is making decisions about the schooling protocol for children around the country. And this, it shouldn't surprise us, Pat. This is much like gerrymandering, much like claiming fraud, much like trying to get ballots thrown out. It's a way to try to get your people in without really doing the work of winning people on policy. And I go back to what I said around the Newsom election, which is that in too many places, it's too easy to launch a recall election. And because a lot of people never hear about it, the scheduling is often special election scheduling, not scheduled election scheduling. You get your side disproportionately turning out, and it's a mechanism that needs to be reformed.
Yeah, it's definitely an effective tactic because obviously, if you win the recall election, then that's good. You get your party in power. But even if you lose, well, you at least took some time away from the people who were in charge because they had to focus on the race instead of doing their job.
And
And
money.
so, in a sense, yeah, and money, and obviously, the special elections, calling those are going to cost the state a lot of resources, or the city and at the local level a lot of resources. So the right tends to win just by instituting these recall elections, even if they don't ultimately win the race. So obviously, it's a good technique for them to be using. But yeah, to your point, I think we definitely have to either get rid of recall elections in different states and municipalities across the country, or we need to up the barrier for entry, right? Because California, for example, they have a population of about 40 million people, and I believe they only needed like 1.2 million signatures to get the Gavin Newsom recall election
Yep.
underway. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously that doesn't add up at all, especially when you have an election where millions and millions of people are going to be voting in it. So, yeah, something has to change on this. I think it does sort of make sense in some circumstances to have the voters be able to recall politicians, but you can also argue that there's impeachment processes and the legislatures can also go about doing that if there really is some reason to remove a person in power. So maybe recall elections don't need to take place anymore. Obviously, we don't have them in every state and we don't have them federally. So yeah, I don't know if I'm like completely against having recall elections altogether, but we obviously have to raise the threshold.
I'm not against it existing as a mechanism, but I do think the threshold has to be raised, and there needs to be some way of it's a mechanism. Aside from raising the threshold, the mechanism favors that party which is moving for the recall, and that is something that somehow needs to be dealt with. And I don't know how you do it. You could whether it's a public notice period with I don't even know, but it's something that needs to be looked at.
With so many of these issues that plague our politics, like gerrymandering, we say like, okay, well, we want to change the system overall, but until we do that, we have to fight fire with fire.
Yeah.
Campaign finance the same way. We can't unilaterally disarm. Do you feel the same way when it comes to recall elections? Like in the meantime, should the focus for Democrats be to recall these Republicans in charge for any reason that they want to come up with, or is that just going to make us look ridiculous and ultimately not be good for us?
Because Democrats are still mostly running on policy, I don't know that it's easier to recall Republicans than to just beat them by running good elections, which Democrats often don't do, which makes me question whether they would actually run recalls the right way anyway. So no, I actually think Democrats are pretty bad at all of this stuff, but they're sort of equally bad. And so I think that their shot is just as good by trying to just beat Republicans in elections than recall them.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And obviously, you only have so many resources. So, anytime that you decide to focus on a Republican politician who maybe made a bad comment or supported a bad policy, that's time away from you pushing for the things that you want to push for.
Yeah.
And we know that, certainly negative campaigning has its place, but overall, it's better in the macro to be pushing for your own policy agenda and not wasting your time on these distractions. So, I get
I
why
agree.
you're
I
saying that.
agree. Curious to hear from the audience. What are your thoughts on recalls? Should they exist? Should Democrats try to use them? That is going to do it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new show and bonus show.